settle into the sleepy mind channel. Today we will explore the sunken Roman city of Baiae, a place where luxury once defined the coastline and where entire villas, bathhouses, and mosaics now rest quietly beneath the water. Along the coast of southern Italy, beneath the calm surface of the Bay of Naples, lies the remains of Baiae, a Roman resort city once known for wealth, excess, and elaborate architecture. Unlike cities that were destroyed suddenly, Baiae did not vanish in a single moment. Instead, it slowly sank over time, its streets and structures gradually lowered into the sea as the land beneath it shifted. Today, underwater ruins stretch across the seabed, including bath complexes, marble floors, statues, and villas that once belonged to some of the most powerful figures in Roman society. Baiae was not an ordinary city. It was a destination where the Roman elite came to relax, socialize, and escape the pressures of political life. Emperors, senators, and wealthy citizens built residences along the coast, creating a landscape filled with terraces, domes, and open views of the water. Heated pools filled with mineral-rich water drew visitors seeking comfort and restoration, while gatherings and daily life centered around leisure rather than survival or defense. What makes Baiae especially unique is not just its luxury, but the way it was lost. The city did not fall to war or disaster. Instead, the ground beneath it slowly shifted due to volcanic activity, causing the land to sink in a process that continued over many years. As the elevation changed, seawater began to move into lower areas, gradually covering structures that had once stood above the surface. This slow transformation preserved much of the city in place, creating an underwater record of Roman life that remains visible today. If you like videos like these, feel free to like and subscribe. More videos are posted weekly. Looking down into the waters above Baiae, it is possible to see outlines of streets, sections of walls, and floors that still hold their original patterns. Mosaics remain arranged in detailed designs, their shapes intact beneath layers of water. Large statues rest on their sides, while columns extend upward from the seabed, marking the spaces where buildings once stood. These remains are not scattered randomly, but positioned in ways that reflect the original layout of the city, offering a clear sense of how Baiae once functioned. The preservation of these structures creates a rare opportunity to observe a Roman city in a state that has not been rebuilt or heavily altered. Instead of layers of construction placed over time, Baiae presents a moment that has settled into stillness. The transition from land to sea happened gradually enough that many elements remained where they were, allowing the arrangement of buildings and spaces to remain visible beneath the surface. The location of Baiae played a major role in both its rise and its transformation. The city was built along the Bay of Naples, an area known for its natural beauty as well as its volcanic activity. The coastline provided calm waters, access to trade routes, and a setting that attracted those seeking relaxation. Meanwhile, the ground beneath the region was influenced by geothermal forces that slowly changed its elevation over time. This balance between stability and movement shaped the development of Baiae. The same conditions that made it desirable also introduced long-term changes that would affect its structure. While the surface appeared calm and stable, the land itself was part of a dynamic system, where pressure beneath the earth could cause gradual lifting or sinking. These changes were not always visible in the moment, but over time they influenced how the city existed within its environment. As Baiae developed, it expanded along the coastline, taking advantage of views, access to water, and the presence of natural thermal springs. These springs produced warm, mineral-rich water that became central to the identity of the city. Bath complexes were built to capture and use this resource, creating spaces where temperature could be controlled and where different rooms offered different experiences. The presence of these natural features shaped both the layout of the city and the activities that took place within it. The use of thermal water in Baiae was not simply a matter of comfort. It reflected a deeper connection between environment and daily life. The water emerged naturally from underground sources, carrying heat generated by volcanic activity. This meant that the city's most defining feature was directly linked to the same forces that would later influence its transformation. The relationship between the surface environment and what existed beneath it was present from the beginning. As visitors arrived in Baiae, they encountered a setting that was designed to support relaxation. Villas were positioned to overlook the sea, with terraces that allowed for open views and access to fresh air. Interiors were decorated with mosaics, marble, and artistic details that reflected wealth and status. These spaces were not built for defense or industry, but for comfort and social life, creating an atmosphere that was distinct from more practical or crowded urban centers. The rhythm of the city was shaped by this focus on leisure. Days were structured around bathing, conversation, and movement between different spaces designed for relaxation. The presence of warm water, open views, and mild coastal conditions created an environment where time moved at a slower pace. This setting allowed residents and visitors to focus on comfort, creating a way of life that emphasized experience rather than urgency. Despite this atmosphere, Baiae was still connected to the wider Roman world. Goods, materials, and people moved through the region, linking the city to trade routes across the Mediterranean. While it functioned as a resort, it was not isolated. The presence of wealth and activity ensured that Baiae remained part of a larger network, even as its daily life appeared more relaxed than that of major political centers. The combination of luxury, environment, and connection made Baiae one of the most desirable locations in Roman society. Its reputation spread through writings and accounts, where it was described as a place of indulgence and escape. This reputation attracted those seeking not only comfort, but also status, as being present in Baiae became associated with wealth and influence. Meanwhile, the conditions beneath the city continued to shift. The ground, formed by volcanic processes, responded to changes in pressure that were not immediately visible at the surface. These gradual movements were part of a process known as bradyseism, where land slowly rises or falls over time. In the case of Baiae, this process led to a gradual lowering of the coastline, bringing sections of the city closer to sea level. At first, these changes likely appeared minor. Slight differences in elevation could affect how water moved during high tides, or how certain areas responded to changing conditions. Over longer periods, however, these small shifts accumulated, creating noticeable changes in how the city interacted with the sea. Areas that had once been safely above the water began to experience occasional flooding, marking the early stages of transformation. The relationship between land and water in Baiae was therefore not fixed, but constantly adjusting. The same coastline that provided stability and beauty also responded to forces that operated over long periods. This interaction created a setting where change was gradual, allowing the city to continue functioning even as conditions shifted beneath it. Understanding Baiae requires looking at both what was visible and what was not. The surface of the city reflected wealth, design, and comfort, while beneath it, geological processes were shaping its future. These two layers, one defined by human activity and the other by natural forces, existed together throughout the life of the city. As we continue exploring Baiae, the focus will move from its setting and identity toward the systems that supported its growth. The way the city developed, expanded, and functioned depended on how it interacted with its environment. Each stage of its existence reveals a balance between opportunity and change, where the same conditions that supported its rise also contributed to its transformation. The remains beneath the water today provide a clear connection to this process. They show a city that was not destroyed in a single event, but gradually altered by forces that acted over time. This makes Baiae not only a place of historical interest, but also an example of how environments shape the life and structure of a settlement. Through this perspective, Baiae can be seen as more than a lost city. It is part of an ongoing process where land, water, and human activity interact. The structures beneath the sea reflect this interaction, preserving a moment where luxury and change existed together along the coast of the Bay of Naples. The setting of Baiae begins with the land itself, shaped by forces that extend far beneath the surface. Along the Bay of Naples, the coastline appears calm, with gentle water and a horizon that stretches outward in a steady line. Yet beneath this surface lies a region defined by constant movement, where heat, pressure, and shifting ground form a system that is always active, even when it is not immediately visible. Baiae existed within an area known for volcanic activity, part of a larger region where the Earth's crust is thinner and more responsive to forces below. This environment created conditions that were both beneficial and unstable at the same time. Warm, mineral-rich water rose naturally through the ground, creating thermal springs that became one of the defining features of the city. These springs provided a steady source of heat, allowing water to remain warm without the need for external fuel, making them both practical and desirable. The presence of these natural springs influenced how the city was built from the very beginning. Instead of forcing the environment to change, the people who developed Baiae worked with what was already there. Structures were positioned to capture the flow of water, and spaces were designed to make use of the natural temperature differences. This created an environment where the land itself contributed directly to daily life, shaping how people moved, gathered, and interacted. Meanwhile, the ground beneath Baiae was not fixed. The region experienced a process known as bradycism, where the land slowly rises or sinks over long periods. This movement is caused by changes in pressure beneath the surface, often linked to volcanic systems that shift gradually rather than erupting suddenly. In Baiae, this process did not produce dramatic events at first, but instead created slow and steady changes in elevation that would become more significant over time. These changes were not always noticeable from one day to the next. The coastline could appear stable, and the buildings could remain in place, giving the impression that the environment was unchanging. However, over longer periods, small shifts began to accumulate. Areas that had once been clearly above the waterline moved closer to it, and the boundary between land and sea began to adjust in subtle ways. The interaction between water and land in this region created a unique balance. The sea provided access, movement, and a sense of openness, while the land offered stability and structure. As long as this balance remained steady, Baiae could continue to function as a thriving coastal city. But because the land itself was slowly changing, the relationship between these two elements was never completely fixed. The geography of the Bay of Naples also contributed to the development of Baiae as a destination. The coastline is curved, creating a natural enclosure that protects the water from strong currents and harsh conditions. This made it easier for boats to approach and anchor, allowing people to arrive from nearby regions with relative ease. The calm waters also added to the sense of tranquility that defined the area, reinforcing its reputation as a place of relaxation. Surrounding the city were hills that rose gently above the coastline, creating natural vantage points. These elevated areas allowed buildings to be constructed with clear views of the sea, while also providing a sense of separation from lower, more crowded spaces. The combination of elevation, water access, and thermal activity made Baiae a location where multiple environmental advantages came together. As the city expanded, these features were incorporated into its layout. Pathways connected different elevations, allowing movement between higher and lower areas without disrupting the natural shape of the land. Buildings were arranged to follow the contours of the coastline, creating a layered structure where each level offered a different perspective. This design reflected an understanding of the environment, where construction adapted to existing conditions rather than replacing them. The thermal springs themselves were not uniform. Different areas produced water at different temperatures, and this variation allowed for a range of uses. Some pools were warmer, offering a sense of deep relaxation, while others were cooler, creating contrast and balance. This natural variation became part of the experience of Baiae, where movement between spaces also meant movement between different physical sensations. These environmental conditions also influenced the materials used in construction. Builders selected stone and other materials that could withstand moisture, heat, and gradual changes in the ground. Structures needed to remain stable even as the land beneath them shifted slightly, requiring a level of flexibility in design. This approach allowed buildings to endure changes that likely damaged more rigid structures. Despite these adaptations, the underlying forces continued to operate. The same geothermal activity that produced warm water also contributed to the gradual movement of the land. Heat and pressure beneath the surface created expansion and contraction, which in turn affected the elevation of the ground above. This process did not occur evenly, meaning that different parts of the city could rise or sink at slightly different rates. Gradually, these differences became more noticeable. Certain areas began to experience changes in how water interacted with the land. During periods of higher tide, water could reach places it had not reached before, creating temporary flooding in lower sections. These events likely seemed minor at first, but they indicated a shift that was becoming more consistent. The people living in Baiae likely observed these changes as part of their environment. Adjustments likely been made, such as reinforcing structures or modifying how spaces were used. Because the transformation was gradual, it did not immediately disrupt daily life. Instead, it introduced a slow awareness that the environment was evolving, even if the full extent of that change was not yet clear. The connection between Baiae and its environment can be understood as a continuous interaction. The city relied on the land for its defining features, but the land itself was not static. This meant that the relationship between human activity and natural forces was always in motion. The structures, pathways, and systems within the city reflected this balance, showing how design and environment work together over time. As the coastline continued to shift, the long-term effects of these changes began to take shape. What had once been stable ground moved incrementally closer to the water, altering how the city was positioned within its surroundings. The sea, which had been a source of access and beauty, gradually became a factor in the transformation of the city itself. Understanding this setting provides a foundation for everything that follows. The rise of Baiae as a center of luxury and leisure was made possible by its environment, but that same environment also contained the conditions that would eventually reshape it. The balance between benefit and change was present from the beginning, creating a story that unfolds through both human design and natural movement. As we move forward, the focus will shift toward how these environmental conditions supported the early growth of Baiae. The resources available, the appeal of the setting, and the way people responded to these features all contributed to the development of a city that became one of the most distinctive locations in the Roman world. Movement through Baiae was shaped not only by its structures, but by the way the landscape guided each step. Paths curved along the natural slope of the land, rising gradually from the water's edge toward higher terraces. As people moved through the city, they experienced subtle changes in elevation, temperature, and atmosphere, creating a sense of transition between spaces rather than a single fixed environment. The presence of thermal activity also influenced how the air felt in different areas. In some locations, warmth could be sensed even before reaching the water itself, as heat from underground sources gently affected the surrounding ground. This created pockets of warmth that contrasted with the cooler coastal air, adding another layer to how the environment was experienced. Sound moved differently through this setting as well. Water flowing through channels, the quiet movement of waves along the shoreline, and the echo of voices within stone structures all combined to create a steady and continuous background. These elements blended together, forming an environment that was active without being overwhelming, where each sound contributed to the overall atmosphere rather than standing apart from it. Light also played a role in defining the space. Reflections from the water shifted throughout the day, casting moving patterns onto nearby surfaces. Open terraces allowed sunlight to reach interior spaces, while covered areas created softer, shaded environments. This variation in light and shadow added depth to the city, making each space feel distinct while still connected to the whole. These sensory details were part of what made Baiae unique. The city was not only built within its environment, but experienced through it, where movement, temperature, sound, and light combined to shape how people interacted with the space. This connection between physical setting and daily experience helped define the character of Baiae, reinforcing its identity as a place where the environment itself became part of the way of life. The early development of Baiae began with a simple interaction between people and the natural features of the coastline. Before it became known as a destination of wealth and luxury, the area was valued for its access to warm, mineral-rich waters and its position along a calm and sheltered bay. These qualities attracted small groups of visitors and settlers who recognized the practical and restorative benefits of the environment. The presence of thermal springs played a central role in shaping the earliest structures in Baiae. Warm water emerging from beneath the ground created natural pools that could be used without the need for complex systems. Early construction focused on stabilizing these areas, forming basic enclosures that allowed people to gather, rest, and make use of the water in a more controlled setting. These initial efforts did not require large-scale design, but they marked the beginning of a pattern where natural resources guided human activity. As interest in the area grew, more permanent structures began to appear. Simple buildings were constructed near the springs, providing places for shelter and extended stays. These early developments were modest compared to what would come later, but they established the foundation of Baiae as a location where people could remain for longer periods rather than passing through briefly. The environment encouraged this transition, offering both comfort and access to resources. The coastline itself also influenced how these early structures were arranged. The gentle curve of the bay created natural landing points for small boats, allowing people to arrive by water with relative ease. This accessibility meant that Baiae was not isolated, even in its earlier stages. Movement between nearby areas was possible, and the flow of people brought new ideas and materials that contributed to gradual expansion. Gradually, the reputation of Baiae began to extend beyond its immediate surroundings. Word of the thermal waters and the calm coastal setting spread through nearby regions, drawing visitors who were curious about the experience. These visitors were not only seeking relaxation, but also a place that offered a different pace from more crowded or demanding environments. The setting allowed them to step away from routine and engage with the landscape in a more direct way. This growing attention led to a shift in how the area was developed. Instead of building only what was necessary, construction began to reflect a desire for comfort and refinement. Structures became more carefully positioned, taking advantage of views and access to water. The arrangement of spaces started to consider how people would move through them, creating a more intentional layout that balanced function with experience. Meanwhile, the natural features of the land continued to guide these decisions. Builders worked with the slope of the terrain, placing structures at different elevations to maintain stability and visibility. This approach reduced the need for large-scale alterations to the land, allowing the environment to remain a visible part of the city's design. The result was a layered landscape where buildings followed the contours of the coastline rather than replacing them. The early use of materials also reflected the conditions of the region. Stone and other durable resources were chosen for their ability to withstand moisture and temperature changes. Because the ground itself was subject to gradual movement, construction needed to be adaptable. This did not mean that structures were temporary, but rather that they were built with an awareness of the environment in which they existed. As more people arrived, the functions of the area began to diversify. What had started as a place centered around natural springs expanded to include spaces for gathering, resting, and social interaction. The presence of multiple visitors at the same time created a need for organization, leading to the development of pathways and defined areas within the landscape. These early systems allowed the settlement to grow without becoming disordered. The influence of Roman culture also became more visible as the area developed. Visitors brought with them expectations about comfort, design, and daily life, shaping how spaces were used and expanded. Even in its early stages, Baiae began to reflect broader patterns of Roman living, where public and private spaces were carefully arranged to support both individual experience and social interaction. This period of development was gradual rather than sudden. There was no single moment when Baiae transformed from a simple gathering place into a structured settlement. Instead, each addition built upon what already existed, creating a continuous process of growth. The environment remained central throughout this process, with each new structure responding to the conditions of the land and water. The presence of thermal water continued to define the identity of the area. As more structures were built, systems were developed to direct and manage the flow of water, allowing it to be used in different ways. These early efforts laid the groundwork for the more complex bath systems that would later become one of the most recognizable features of Baiae. The transition from natural pools to managed spaces represented an important step in the city's evolution. Movement within the settlement also became more organized. Paths connected different areas, guiding people between the shoreline, the springs, and the structures built around them. These routes followed the natural shape of the land, creating a sense of continuity between different parts of the settlement. Rather than imposing a rigid grid, the layout allowed for gradual transitions that reflected the environment. As the settlement continued to grow, its role within the region became more defined. Baiae was no longer just a place to visit briefly, but a location where people could spend extended periods. This shift encouraged further development, as longer stays required additional services and more comfortable living conditions. The balance between natural features and constructed spaces became more refined, setting the stage for future expansion. The early stages of Baiae reveal a pattern of development that is closely tied to its environment. Each decision, from the placement of structures to the use of materials, reflects an awareness of the conditions that made the area both appealing and challenging. This relationship between people and place is a key part of understanding how Baiae evolved over time. Meanwhile, the underlying geological forces continued to operate. The ground beneath the settlement remained part of a dynamic system, influenced by heat and pressure from below. While these forces did not immediately disrupt development, they were present throughout this period, shaping the land in ways that would become more significant in the future. The combination of gradual growth and constant environmental change created a setting where stability and movement existed together. Baiae developed as a place of comfort and access, but it did so within a landscape that was never completely fixed. This balance would define the city's trajectory, influencing both its rise and its eventual transformation. As Baiae moved beyond its early development, the focus shifted toward expansion and the increasing presence of wealth. The foundation that had been established through natural resources and gradual construction made it possible for the city to evolve into a destination that attracted some of the most influential individuals in Roman society. As the settlement continued to take shape, the qualities that defined Baiae became more noticeable to those beyond the immediate region. What had begun as a place valued for its natural features started to gain attention for the way those features were being used. The combination of warm water, coastal views, and an environment designed for comfort created a setting that stood apart from more practical or crowded locations. Travel between regions allowed this reputation to spread. Visitors who experienced Baiae carried descriptions of the area with them, sharing accounts of a place where the environment supported rest rather than labor. These descriptions attracted individuals who were not only interested in the natural resources, but also in the possibility of creating residences that reflected a different way of living. This gradual shift marked the beginning of a transition from simple use of the landscape to more deliberate development. The presence of visitors with greater resources encouraged construction that went beyond basic structures. Spaces were expanded, materials became more refined, and attention to design increased as the settlement adapted to new expectations. The environment remained central throughout this change. Even as development became more intentional, it continued to follow the patterns established by the land itself. The slopes, the water, and the thermal activity all remained guiding factors, ensuring that growth did not separate the city from the conditions that had made it desirable in the first place. This stage of development created a bridge between the early formation of Baiae and its later identity as a center of luxury. The same features that had attracted small groups of visitors now began to draw the attention of individuals with the means to transform the settlement into something more elaborate. From this point forward, the character of Baiae would begin to shift, moving steadily toward a period defined by wealth, expansion, and a more visible display of status. As Baiae moved beyond its early stages of development, the character of the settlement began to change in a more visible and deliberate way. What had once been a place shaped primarily by natural features and modest construction started to evolve into a destination defined by wealth, design, and a growing sense of status. This transition did not occur all at once, but developed gradually as individuals with greater resources began to invest in the area. The appeal of Baiae extended beyond its thermal waters and coastal setting. It offered something less tangible, but equally important, a separation from the demands of political and urban life. For members of the Roman elite, the ability to step away from the structure of the city and enter an environment focused on comfort and leisure held strong value. This made Baiae not just a location, but an experience that reflected a different way of living. As more wealthy individuals arrived, the scale and complexity of construction increased. Villas began to replace simpler structures, each designed to provide both comfort and visibility. These residences were not hidden within the landscape, but positioned to take full advantage of views across the bay. Large openings, terraces, and elevated platforms allowed residents to look outward, creating a connection between private space and the surrounding environment. The design of these villas reflected a shift in purpose. Instead of focusing on basic needs, architecture began to emphasize experience. Interiors were arranged to create a sense of flow, guiding movement from one space to another in a way that felt natural and unhurried. Rooms were designed with attention to light, air, and temperature, ensuring that each area offered a distinct but connected atmosphere. Materials used in construction also became more refined. Stone was shaped with greater precision, and decorative elements were added to surfaces that had once been left plain. Marble, mosaic, and carefully arranged patterns began to appear, transforming functional spaces into environments that reflected wealth and taste. These details did not serve a structural purpose, but contributed to the overall impression of luxury that defined Baiae during this period. The presence of multiple villas along the coastline created a layered visual effect. Structures were built at different elevations, each one positioned to maintain a clear view, while also fitting within the natural contours of the land. This arrangement allowed for both privacy and connection, as each residence existed within a shared environment without becoming isolated from it. The concept of ownership in Baiae extended beyond the physical boundaries of a single building. The surrounding landscape became part of the experience, with open spaces, gardens, and access to the shoreline included as extensions of private property. This blurred the line between constructed space and natural environment, reinforcing the idea that the entire setting was part of the lifestyle associated with the city. As development continued, Baiae became known as a destination where social life played a central role. Visitors did not simply remain within their own residences, but moved between different spaces, interacting with others who had come to the area for similar reasons. This movement created a network of connections that extended beyond individual buildings, shaping the overall atmosphere of the city. The presence of wealth influenced not only the appearance of Baiae, but also how it functioned. Services developed to support the needs of residents and visitors, including the maintenance of structures, the preparation of food, and the management of daily activities. Workers and support systems became part of the landscape, ensuring that the experience of comfort could be sustained over time. Despite this focus on leisure, Baiae was not disconnected from the broader Roman world. It remained part of a network of trade and movement, with goods and materials arriving from different regions. This allowed for the continued expansion of construction, as resources could be brought in to support new projects and maintain existing structures. The reputation of Baiae grew as its development became more visible. Accounts of the city described it as a place of indulgence, where the boundaries of normal behavior were often relaxed. This reputation attracted even more visitors, reinforcing the cycle of growth and increasing the concentration of wealth within the area. Architecture continued to evolve in response to these changes. Larger complexes were constructed, combining multiple functions within a single structure. Spaces for relaxation, gathering, and private living were integrated into cohesive designs, creating environments that could support extended stays without the need to leave the immediate area. The use of terraces became more prominent during this period. By building outward and upward along the slopes, architects were able to create multiple levels that connected different parts of a residence. These terraces provided open space, access to light, and uninterrupted views, enhancing the sense of openness that defined Baiae. Water remained a central element throughout this transformation. Pools, channels, and access points were incorporated into the design of villas, allowing residents to interact directly with the sea and with thermal water sources. This integration of water into daily life reinforced the connection between the environment and the built space, maintaining a link to the natural features that had originally defined the area. As Baiae became more established as a center of luxury, the distinction between public and private space began to shift. Areas that had once been shared more openly became associated with specific residences, while new shared spaces were created to accommodate the growing number of visitors. This reorganization reflected the changing scale of the city, as well as the increasing importance of status and ownership. The concentration of wealth in Baiae also influenced the types of activities that took place there. Gatherings, conversations, and periods of rest became central to daily life, replacing the more practical tasks that defined other settlements. This focus on experience shaped the rhythm of the city, creating an environment where time was structured around comfort rather than necessity. Meanwhile, the underlying environment remained unchanged in its nature, even as the surface became more elaborate. The same geothermal forces that had attracted early visitors continued to operate beneath the ground, providing warmth and influencing the stability of the land. While these forces were not the focus of daily life, they remained an essential part of the setting. The rise of luxury in Baiae can therefore be seen as a layer added to an already complex environment. The city did not lose its connection to natural processes, but instead built upon them, creating a setting where human design and environmental conditions existed together. This combination allowed Baiae to reach a level of development that was both distinctive and deeply tied to its location. As this period continued, Baiae reached a point where its identity as a place of wealth and leisure was firmly established. The foundations laid during its early development supported a more elaborate and visible expression of status, setting the stage for further growth in both scale and complexity. This phase of expansion would lead directly into a deeper integration of systems within the city, particularly those related to bathing, water management, and the use of thermal resources. The next stage of Baiae's development would focus on how these systems were refined and expanded, creating some of the most recognizable and influential features of the city. As the city continued to grow as a center of wealth and leisure, the systems that supported daily life became more refined and more central to the identity of the city. Among these, the bath complexes stood out as some of the most important and carefully developed spaces. While thermal water had been present from the beginning, this stage marked the transition from simple use of natural pools to highly organized environments designed to guide movement, control temperature, and shape social interaction. The bath complexes of Baiae were not isolated structures, but integrated systems that combined architecture, water flow, and human activity into a unified experience. Each space was arranged to serve a specific purpose, with rooms designed to hold different temperatures and provide different sensations. Movement through these spaces followed a sequence, allowing visitors to transition gradually between conditions rather than encountering sudden changes. The process often began in areas where the temperature was moderate, allowing the body to adjust before moving into warmer rooms. From there, Visitors could enter spaces where the heat was more intense, created either by direct use of thermal water or by systems that captured and distributed warmth. These hotter areas were designed to encourage relaxation, with the surrounding structure holding in heat and creating a consistent environment. Beyond the warmest rooms, cooler areas provided contrast. These spaces allowed for recovery and balance, creating a rhythm within the experience of bathing. The movement between warm and cool environments was not random, but structured in a way that reflected both practical understanding and cultural preference. This sequence became an expected part of the routine, shaping how people used the baths over time. The engineering behind these systems required careful planning. Water needed to be directed into different areas, controlled in terms of temperature, and maintained at a steady level. Channels and conduits were built to guide the flow, ensuring that each space received the appropriate amount of water without disrupting the overall balance. These systems operated continuously, supporting the function of the baths without requiring constant manual adjustment. Heat distribution was also managed through design. The structure of the buildings helped to retain warmth, with thick walls and enclosed spaces preventing heat from escaping too quickly. In some areas, additional techniques were used to enhance this effect, allowing certain rooms to maintain higher temperatures for longer periods. This control over the environment made the baths more reliable and more comfortable for regular use. The layout of the bath complexes reflected an understanding of both movement and interaction. Open areas allowed for gathering and conversation, while more enclosed spaces provided privacy. This balance created an environment where people could engage with others while also experiencing moments of quiet. The design supported both social activity and individual relaxation, making the baths central to the daily rhythm of Baiae. Decoration within these spaces also contributed to the experience. Mosaics, stone surfaces, and carefully arranged patterns added visual detail, transforming functional areas into environments that reflected wealth and attention to design. These elements did not interfere with the operation of the baths, but enhanced the atmosphere, making each space feel intentional and complete. Light played an important role in shaping these environments. Openings were positioned to allow natural light to enter at different angles, creating variations in brightness throughout the day. In warmer rooms, filtered light softened the intensity of the space, while cooler areas could feel more open and illuminated. This variation added depth to the experience, guiding movement not only through temperature, but also through changes in light. Sound within the bath complexes formed part of the overall environment as well. Water moving through channels, the gentle echo of voices, and the interaction between surfaces created a steady background that was consistent but not overwhelming. These sounds reinforce the sense of continuity within the space, connecting different rooms through a shared atmosphere. The presence of these bath systems also influenced how other parts of the city developed. Villas and public spaces were often positioned in relation to bath complexes, allowing for easy access and integration into daily routines. This connection made the baths more than a separate feature, turning them into a central element around which other structures were arranged. As more people visited Baiae, the scale of these complexes increased. Larger spaces were constructed to accommodate greater numbers, and additional rooms were added to provide more variation in temperature and function. This expansion did not disrupt the existing systems, but extended them, maintaining the same principles while increasing capacity. The operation of the baths required ongoing attention, even if much of the system functioned automatically through natural forces. Water flow needed to remain consistent, and structures had to be maintained to ensure that they continued to perform as intended. Workers were responsible for overseeing these processes, ensuring that the experience remained stable for those who used the facilities. Despite the level of design and engineering involved, the baths remained closely connected to the natural features that had originally defined Baiae. Thermal water continued to rise from underground sources, providing a steady input that supported the entire system. The built environment did not replace this natural process, but organized it, shaping it into a form that could be used more effectively. The role of the baths extended beyond physical comfort. They became places where social interaction took place in a structured but relaxed setting. Conversations, gatherings, and shared routines created connections between visitors, reinforcing the social nature of the city. The baths provided a space where status could be displayed subtly, through presence and participation, rather than through formal roles. The experience of moving through a bath complex was therefore both physical and social. Temperature changes affected the body, while the arrangement of spaces influenced how people interacted. This combination made the baths one of the most defining features of Baiae, shaping not only daily routines, but also the overall identity of the city. Meanwhile, the reliance on thermal systems meant that the baths were tied directly to the geological conditions beneath the surface. The same forces that provided heat and water also contributed to the gradual movement of the land. While this connection was not always visible, it remained an underlying factor that linked the function of the baths to the long-term changes affecting the city. As the city continued to develop, these systems became more integrated with other aspects of the urban environment. Water management, architecture, and social activity all intersected within the bath complexes, creating a network of relationships that supported the city as a whole. The refinement of these systems marked a stage where Baiae reached a level of complexity that went beyond its early development. This focus on organized systems and controlled environments would continue to influence the city as it expanded further. The ability to shape natural resources into structured experiences became a defining characteristic, allowing Baiae to maintain its reputation as a place where comfort and design were closely connected. From this point, the development of Baiae would extend into other areas, including architecture and infrastructure, where similar principles of adaptation and refinement would be applied. The bath complexes, however, would remain at the center of this progression, representing both the technical skill and the cultural values that defined the city during its height. The experience within these bath complexes was also shaped by time. Visitors did not move quickly from one space to another, but instead followed a slower rhythm that allowed each stage to settle before continuing. This pacing created a sense of continuity, where the transition between temperatures and environments felt gradual and intentional rather than abrupt. The duration of time spent in each area could vary, but the overall experience was designed to encourage extended use. Warm rooms invited longer stays, while cooler areas provided brief moments of contrast before returning to heat. This balance created a cycle that could be repeated, reinforcing a steady and calming pattern within the space. The presence of multiple rooms also allowed individuals to choose how they moved through the environment. While there was a general sequence, it was not rigidly enforced. Visitors could adjust their path based on preference, creating a sense of personal control within a shared system. This flexibility contributed to the overall comfort of the baths, making them adaptable to different needs. Interaction between visitors formed another layer of the experience. Conversations could begin in one room and continue into another, carried through the progression of spaces. The shared environment encouraged this continuity, allowing social connections to develop naturally without requiring formal settings. In this way, the bath complexes supported both physical and social flow at the same time. Even the surfaces within the baths played a role in shaping the experience. Stone retained warmth in heated areas, while cooler surfaces provided contrast in other spaces. The textures and temperatures of these materials added subtle variations, reinforcing the transitions between different environments without the need for additional structure. These details, though small on their own, combined to create a system that was both controlled and responsive. The bath complexes were not simply places where water was used, but environments where movement, time, temperature, and interaction were carefully balanced. This level of refinement reflects the importance of the baths within Baiae, showing how deeply they were integrated into the daily life and identity of the city. The architecture of Baiae developed as a direct response to both its environment and its role as a place of leisure. Unlike cities that were built for defense or dense urban activity, Baiae was designed to support comfort, openness, and connection to the surrounding landscape. This focus influenced every aspect of construction, from the placement of buildings along the coastline to the way individual spaces were arranged within each structure. One of the most defining features of Baiae's architecture was its use of elevation. The natural slope of the land allowed builders to create layered structures that followed the contours of the coastline. Villas and complexes were positioned at different heights, creating a stepped arrangement that ensured clear views of the bay while maintaining stability on uneven ground. This approach allowed each structure to exist within its own space while still forming part of a larger connected landscape. Terraces became a central element in this design. These open platforms extended outward from buildings, creating spaces where people could gather, rest, or simply look out over the water. Terraces also served a practical purpose, acting as transitions between different levels and allowing movement across the slope without disrupting the natural shape of the land. By combining function and experience, these features reinforce the connection between architecture and environment. The use of arches and domes added both strength and visual continuity to the structures of Baiae. Arches allowed for wider openings without compromising stability, creating spaces that felt open while remaining structurally sound. Domes, often placed over bath areas or large rooms, help to distribute weight evenly while also enclosing heat and sound. These forms were not only practical, but also contributed to the identity of the city, giving it a recognizable architectural character. Materials were selected with careful attention to the conditions of the region. Stone was widely used for its durability, especially in areas exposed to moisture and temperature changes. Builders shaped and arranged these materials in ways that allowed structures to remain stable even as the ground beneath them shifted slightly. This adaptability was essential in an environment where long-term geological movement was always present. Interior spaces were designed to reflect the same balance between openness and structure. Large openings allowed light and air to move freely through rooms, creating environments that felt connected to the outside rather than enclosed. Meanwhile, walls and partitions provided definition, ensuring that each space maintained its own function and atmosphere. Decoration played an important role in reinforcing the sense of luxury within these spaces. Mosaics covered floors and walls, forming patterns that added both texture and visual interest. Marble surfaces reflected light, enhancing the brightness of interior areas and creating a sense of refinement. These decorative elements were integrated into the structure rather than applied separately, making them a natural part of the architectural design. The relationship between indoor and outdoor space was carefully managed. Rather than separating these environments completely, architects allowed them to blend into one another. Open courtyards, partially enclosed rooms, and transitional spaces created a gradual shift between interior and exterior. This approach made it possible to experience the environment while still benefiting from the comfort of constructed spaces. Water was incorporated into architectural design in multiple ways. Pools, channels, and access points were built directly into structures, allowing water to move through and around the buildings. This integration reinforced the importance of water within the city, making it a visible and constant presence rather than a separate feature. The sound and movement of water added to the overall atmosphere, contributing to the sense of calm that defined Baiae. The layout of individual villas reflected both personal preference and broader cultural patterns. While each residence had its own arrangement, certain elements remained consistent, including areas for gathering, spaces for rest, and connections to outdoor views. This consistency created a shared architectural language across the city, even as individual structures varied in size and detail. As construction expanded, larger complexes began to appear, combining multiple functions within a single design. These structures included living areas, bath spaces, and open terraces, all arranged to support extended stays. The integration of these elements allowed residents to move between different activities without leaving the immediate environment, reinforcing the idea of Baiae as a self-contained space for leisure. Pathways and connecting structures linked these buildings together, forming a network that allowed movement across the city. These routes followed the natural shape of the land, creating a sense of continuity that connected different areas without imposing a rigid grid. This flexibility made it possible to expand the city over time without disrupting its overall structure. The architectural approach in Baiae also reflected an understanding of long-term environmental conditions. Builders anticipated the effects of moisture, temperature changes, and gradual ground movement, incorporating features that allowed structures to adjust without failing. This did not prevent all future changes, but it extended the lifespan of buildings and contributed to their preservation even after partial submersion. Light and shadow were used intentionally within these designs. Openings were positioned to capture sunlight at different times of day, creating shifting patterns that moved across surfaces. Shaded areas provided contrast, offering cooler and more subdued environments within the same structure. This variation added depth to the experience of each space, making it feel dynamic rather than static. Sound also interacted with architectural form. Curved surfaces, enclosed rooms, and open terraces all influenced how sound traveled through the environment. Voices, water movement, and ambient noise combined to create a steady background that connected different parts of the city. These acoustic qualities were not always designed intentionally, but they became part of the overall experience. As Baiae reached its peak, its architecture represented a combination of technical skill and environmental awareness. The structures were not only functional, but also expressive, reflecting the values of a society that prioritized comfort, visibility, and connection to its surroundings. Each building contributed to a larger composition, forming a city that was both unified and varied. Meanwhile, the reliance on natural features remained evident. The architecture did not replace the environment, but worked alongside it, using its resources and adapting to its conditions. This relationship ensured that the identity of Baiae remained tied to its setting, even as the scale of development increased. The buildings of Baiae therefore stand as examples of how design can respond to both human needs and environmental constraints. They show a balance between stability and adaptability, where structures are created to endure while still acknowledging the possibility of change. This balance would become increasingly important as the underlying forces affecting the land continued to shape the city over time. As the city continued to expand, attention would turn toward the systems that supported these structures, including the management of water, movement, and maintenance. These systems would form the next layer of development, building upon the architectural foundation to create a city that functioned as a coordinated and interconnected whole. The durability of these structures can also be understood through the way they responded to gradual environmental change. Rather than remaining completely rigid, many elements of the architecture allowed for slight shifts without immediate damage. Foundations distributed weight across wider areas, reducing pressure on any single point, while layered construction helped absorb minor movement in the ground beneath. This flexibility did not eliminate the effects of long-term change, but it delayed visible damage and allowed the city to continue functioning as conditions slowly evolved. Walls remained standing, terraces held their shape, and key structural forms continued to support daily activity even as the land itself adjusted. This ability to endure gradual change became an important factor in both the longevity of Baiae during its peak and the preservation of its remains after submersion. The infrastructure of Baiae developed as a system that supported both its physical environment and its role as a place of extended leisure. Unlike cities that were designed primarily for defense or dense population, Baiae required systems that could maintain comfort, manage natural resources, and allow for smooth movement between different parts of the landscape. These systems were built to function quietly in the background, supporting daily life without drawing attention to themselves. One of the most important elements of this infrastructure was the management of water. Baiae relied on both natural thermal sources and additional water supply systems to maintain its baths, pools, and residential spaces. Channels were constructed to guide water from its source to specific locations, ensuring that it reached the areas where it was needed without unnecessary loss. These channels followed the natural slope of the land, allowing gravity to assist in the movement of water and reducing the need for mechanical intervention. The distribution of water required careful planning. Different spaces within the city depended on different types of water, whether for bathing, cleaning, or general use. Systems were designed to separate and direct these flows, maintaining balance across the entire network. This separation ensured that thermal water could be used effectively without interfering with other functions, preserving both efficiency and comfort. Drainage was equally important within this system. As water moved through baths and pools, it needed to be removed and redirected to prevent overflow or damage to surrounding structures. Channels and outlets carried used water away, often returning it to the sea or to areas where it could be safely dispersed. This continuous movement created a cycle that allowed water to be used without disrupting the stability of the city. Movement through Baiae was supported by a network of pathways that connected different elevations and areas. These routes were designed to follow the natural contours of the land, creating a flow that felt gradual rather than forced. Steps, ramps, and level paths allowed people to move between terraces, villas, and public spaces without difficulty. This approach ensured that the city remained accessible, even as it expanded across uneven terrain. The placement of these pathways also reflected patterns of use. Routes connected areas that were frequently visited, such as bath complexes and residential spaces, while also providing access to the shoreline and other key features. This network allowed for continuous movement, making it possible to travel across the city without encountering significant barriers. The result was an environment where movement felt natural and uninterrupted. Support systems extended beyond water and pathways to include the maintenance of structures and daily operations. Workers were responsible for ensuring that channels remained clear, that buildings were stable, and that spaces were kept in a condition suitable for use. This ongoing effort allowed the city to function smoothly, even as the environment introduced gradual changes. Storage and supply systems were also part of this infrastructure. Goods needed to be stored, prepared, and distributed to support both residents and visitors. Areas were designated for these purposes, often positioned in ways that kept them accessible but separate from spaces intended for relaxation. This organization ensured that practical functions did not interfere with the overall atmosphere of the city. The relationship between infrastructure and environment remained central throughout this development. Systems were designed to work with natural conditions rather than against them. Water followed existing slopes, pathways adapted to the terrain, and structures were maintained with an understanding of the underlying geological activity. This approach allowed the city to operate efficiently while remaining connected to its setting. As Baiae expanded, these systems grew more complex. Additional channels were added to manage increased water use, and pathways were extended to connect new areas. Despite this growth, the underlying principles remained consistent, ensuring that the infrastructure continued to function as a unified system rather than a collection of separate parts. The integration of infrastructure into the landscape also contributed to the overall experience of the city. Because these systems were not intrusive, they allowed the focus to remain on comfort and environment. Visitors could move through the city without being aware of the mechanisms supporting it, creating a sense of ease that reinforced Baiae's identity as a place of relaxation. Meanwhile, The reliance on these systems meant that any change in the environment likely an impact on how they functioned. Gradual shifts in the land could affect the flow of water, alter the position of pathways, or change the stability of certain areas. While these effects were not immediate, they introduced a layer of complexity that required ongoing attention. The connection between infrastructure and geological activity became more significant over time. As the ground shifted, adjustments were needed to maintain the balance of the system. Channels might need to be redirected, and pathways could require reinforcement. These changes reflected the dynamic nature of the environment, showing how infrastructure had to adapt in response to long-term movement. Despite these challenges, the systems in Baiae remained effective for extended periods. The ability to manage water, support movement, and maintain structures allowed the city to continue functioning even as conditions evolved. This resilience was a key factor in the longevity of Baiae during its peak. The organization of infrastructure also influenced how people experienced the city. Clear pathways, reliable water systems, and well-maintained spaces created an environment where daily life could proceed without disruption. This consistency supported the sense of comfort that defined Baiae, allowing residents and visitors to focus on their surroundings rather than on practical concerns. The presence of these systems highlights the level of planning involved in the development of Baiae. While the city is often associated with luxury and leisure, it relied on a foundation of carefully designed infrastructure to sustain that lifestyle. Without these systems, the experience of comfort and ease would not have been possible. Meanwhile, the infrastructure remained closely tied to the environment that supported it. The same forces that provided resources also influenced how those resources could be managed. This connection created a balance that defined the city, where human design and natural conditions worked together to maintain stability. As the city continued to evolve, the role of infrastructure would become even more critical. The gradual changes in the land would begin to affect not only individual structures, but the systems that connected them. Understanding how these systems functioned provides insight into how the city responded to those changes and how it continued to operate during periods of transformation. This stage of development marks a point where Baiae had reached a high level of organization. The combination of architecture, water management, and movement created a city that functioned as an interconnected whole. From this foundation, the next phase would involve the growing influence of environmental change as the balance between stability and movement began to shift more noticeably. The coordination between these systems required an awareness of timing as well as structure. Water flow, movement of people, and the use of shared spaces all followed patterns that repeated throughout the day. By aligning these patterns, the infrastructure supported a steady rhythm, rather than creating points of congestion or disruption. This allowed different parts of the city to function together without interfering with one another. Access points between areas were also designed to manage transitions smoothly. Entrances to bath complexes, pathways between terraces, and connections to residential spaces were positioned in ways that guided movement without forcing it. This subtle control helped maintain order while preserving the sense of ease that defined Baiae, ensuring that movement felt natural even within a carefully organized system. The visibility of infrastructure was intentionally limited. Channels, supports, and structural elements were often integrated into the design of buildings or placed in locations where they did not draw attention. This approach allowed the practical aspects of the city to remain present without becoming the focus, keeping the experience centered on comfort and environment rather than on the systems themselves. Gradually, this balance between visibility and function became one of the defining features of Baiae. The infrastructure supported the city quietly and consistently, creating a foundation that allowed all other aspects of life to operate without interruption. This quiet efficiency reflects the level of coordination achieved during the height of Baiae's development, where complex systems worked together in a way that felt almost effortless. The stability of Baiae was always influenced by forces that existed beneath the surface, even during periods when the city appeared to be at its peak. While the environment above ground supported comfort, movement, and design, the land itself was part of a much larger system shaped by volcanic and geothermal activity. This system did not operate through sudden or dramatic events in most cases, but through gradual shifts that unfolded over long periods of time. The region surrounding the Bay of Naples is part of a volcanic area where the Earth's crust is thinner and more responsive to pressure from below. Heat generated within the Earth creates movement in underground materials, leading to changes in how the land behaves at the surface. These changes can take many forms, but in Baiae, they were most clearly expressed through a process known as bradycism, where the ground slowly rises or sinks over time. Bradycism is not a sudden event, but a continuous process that reflects the shifting balance of pressure beneath the Earth's surface. When pressure increases, the ground can rise slightly. When it decreases, the land can sink. These movements are often measured over years or even centuries, making them difficult to notice in the moment, but significant when viewed over longer periods. In Baiae, this process led to a gradual lowering of the land relative to the sea. At first, the changes were subtle. Structures remained stable, pathways functioned as expected, and daily life continued without interruption. However, small differences in elevation began to affect how water interacted with the land, particularly in areas closer to the coastline. As the ground shifted, the relationship between land and sea began to change. Areas that had once been safely above the waterline moved closer to it, and during periods of higher tide, water could reach places it had not reached before. These early signs of change likely appeared temporary or manageable, but they indicated a deeper process that was continuing beneath the surface. The presence of thermal activity added another layer to this system. The same geothermal forces that produced warm mineral-rich water also contributed to the movement of the land. Heat and pressure built up beneath the surface, influencing both the availability of thermal water and the stability of the ground above. This connection meant that the most desirable feature of Baiae was directly linked to the forces that would eventually alter it. As these processes continued, the effects became more noticeable. Lower sections of the city began to experience more frequent contact with water, and structures in these areas were exposed to conditions they had not originally been designed to handle. Stone surfaces that had once remained dry were now subject to moisture, and pathways required adjustments to remain usable. Despite these changes, the transformation of Baiae was not immediate. The gradual nature of bradycism allowed the city to continue functioning even as conditions shifted. Residents and visitors adapted to the environment, making small adjustments that allowed daily life to proceed. This period of adaptation reflects the slow pace of geological change, where long-term processes do not always produce immediate disruption. The interaction between infrastructure and environmental change became increasingly important during this time. Water management systems had to respond to shifting elevations, ensuring that channels continued to direct water effectively. Pathways required reinforcement or alteration to maintain accessibility, and structures needed ongoing maintenance to remain stable. These adjustments highlight the resilience of the systems that supported Baiae. While the environment was changing, the city did not collapse suddenly. Instead, it continued to operate within a shifting landscape, demonstrating an ability to adapt to gradual transformation. This resilience, however, had limits, as the underlying processes continued to influence the land. The accumulation of small changes eventually led to more consistent effects. Areas that had experienced occasional flooding began to remain partially submerged for longer periods. The boundary between land and sea moved inward, altering the shape of the coastline and the position of structures within it. What had once been temporary conditions became more permanent features of the environment. The concept of stability in Baiae therefore shifted over time. Instead of a fixed relationship between land and water, the city existed within a dynamic system where conditions were always adjusting. This required a continuous response from those who lived and worked there, as well as from the structures and systems that supported the city. The gradual nature of this transformation also contributed to the preservation of Baiae in its later state. Because the land sank slowly rather than collapsing suddenly, many structures remained intact as they moved below the waterline. Walls, floors, and architectural features retained their original positions, creating a record of the city that would later be visible beneath the sea. This process stands in contrast to more sudden forms of destruction, where buildings are damaged or displaced by rapid events. In Baiae, the slow movement of the land allowed for a different kind of transformation, where change occurred without immediate loss of structure. This distinction is important in understanding why the remains of the city are preserved in such a recognizable form. The influence of geological activity also extended beyond the physical changes to the land. It shaped how the city was perceived and experienced, introducing a sense of uncertainty that may not have been fully understood at the time. While the gradual nature of the process made it less disruptive in the short term, it created conditions that would eventually lead to more significant changes. As the transformation continued, the balance between adaptation and limitation became more apparent. Systems could adjust to a certain extent, and structures could be maintained, but the ongoing movement of the land introduced challenges that could not be resolved indefinitely. The interaction between human design and natural forces reached a point where the latter began to dominate. Understanding this stage of Baiae's development provides insight into how environmental processes influence long-term outcomes. The city's reliance on its setting made it vulnerable to the same forces that had supported its growth. This connection between benefit and risk is a key part of the story, showing how the environment can shape both the rise and transformation of a settlement. The gradual sinking of the land also affected how different parts of the city were used. Areas at higher elevations remained more stable for longer periods, while lower sections experienced earlier and more pronounced changes. This created a shifting pattern of use, where certain spaces became less practical, while others continued to function. These differences likely influenced decisions about where to build, where to maintain structures, and where to withdraw from certain areas. The changing landscape required a response that balanced immediate needs with long-term conditions, reflecting the complexity of living within a dynamic environment. As Baiae moved further into this period of transformation, the effects of geological instability became increasingly visible. The interaction between land and water was no longer subtle, and the processes that had once been gradual began to produce more noticeable changes in the structure and function of the city. This stage sets the foundation for the next phase, where the gradual effects of instability lead to more direct interaction with the sea. The shift from occasional flooding to partial submersion marks a transition where the environment begins to reshape the city in a more visible and lasting way. Through this progression, Baiae illustrates how long-term geological processes can influence the course of a city's development. The forces beneath the surface, though often unseen, play a central role in shaping what exists above. In Baiae, this relationship becomes increasingly clear as the city moves toward a state where land and water begin to merge. The understanding of these processes also provides context for how Baiae is studied today. The preserved remains beneath the water offer a direct connection to the conditions that shape the city, allowing modern observation of both human design and environmental change. This combination makes Baiae a unique example of how gradual transformation can create a lasting record. As we continue, the focus will shift toward how these geological changes led to the gradual submersion of the city. The transition from land to water did not occur all at once, but through a series of stages that reflect the ongoing interaction between natural forces and human structures. The gradual submersion of Baiae did not occur as a single event, but as a sequence of changes that unfolded over time, each stage building upon the last. What had begun as subtle shifts in elevation developed into a more direct interaction between the city and the sea. The boundary that once separated land from water became less defined, and the coastline began to move inward in a way that was both steady and irreversible. At first, the effects of this transformation were limited to the lowest areas of the city. Sections of the coastline that had once been dry experienced occasional flooding during periods of higher tide. Water would enter these spaces temporarily, covering floors and pathways before receding again. These events likely seemed manageable at the time, as they did not immediately prevent the use of the affected areas. Gradually, however, these occurrences became more frequent. The land continued to sink gradually, and the sea began to reach further into the city with greater consistency. What had once been occasional flooding started to become a regular condition, altering how certain spaces could be used. Residents and visitors likely adjusted their routines, avoiding areas that were more frequently affected while continuing to use those that remained stable. The transformation was uneven across the city. Higher elevations retained their position above the water for longer periods, while lower sections experienced earlier and more pronounced changes. This created a shifting pattern where parts of Baiae remained functional, while others began to transition into a different state. The city, in effect, existed in multiple stages of transformation at the same time. As water entered the city more consistently, its presence began to influence the physical condition of structures. Stone surfaces that had once remained dry were now exposed to moisture for extended periods. This exposure did not immediately destroy the structures, but it introduced changes in texture and stability that accumulated over time. Pathways became more difficult to use, and certain features required additional maintenance to remain accessible. The interaction between water and architecture also created new visual patterns. Reflections from the surface moved across submerged areas, altering how spaces appeared. Walls and floors that had once been clearly visible took on a different quality when seen through water, creating a layered effect that combined structure with movement. These changes marked a transition from a fully terrestrial environment to one that was increasingly influenced by the sea. Adaptation remained possible during this stage, but it required continuous effort. Water management systems needed to respond to the changing conditions, redirecting flow and preventing damage where possible. Structures were reinforced, and certain areas likely been modified to accommodate the presence of water. These adjustments allowed the city to continue functioning, even as its relationship with the environment shifted. Despite these efforts, the underlying process of bradyseism continued. The land did not stabilize, and the gradual sinking persisted. This meant that each adaptation was temporary, addressing immediate conditions without altering the long-term trajectory of change. Gradually, the balance between maintaining the city and responding to environmental forces became more difficult to sustain. As the sea moved further inland, entire sections of Baiae began to exist in a state of partial submersion. Buildings that had once stood fully above the waterline found their lower levels submerged, while upper sections remained accessible. This created a layered structure where different parts of the same building existed in different environmental conditions. The use of these partially submerged spaces likely changed as well. Areas that could no longer support regular activity likely been abandoned or repurposed, while others continued to function with adjustments. This selective use reflects a period where the city was still active, but increasingly shaped by the presence of water. The shifting coastline also affected how people moved through Baiae. Pathways that had once connected different areas were altered or disrupted, requiring new routes to be established. Movement became more complex, as the layout of the city no longer matched its original design. These changes influenced daily routines, gradually altering the rhythm of life within the city. The presence of water within the city also changed the sensory experience of Baiae. Sounds became more muted in submerged areas, while reflections and movement on the water's surface introduced new visual elements. The environment, once defined by a balance between land and sea, began to take on a different character, where water played a more dominant role. As more structures were affected, the distinction between usable and unusable space became increasingly clear. Areas that remained dry continued to support activity, while submerged sections transitioned into a different state, no longer part of the active city, but still present within its overall structure. This division marked a shift from adaptation toward gradual loss of function. The transformation of Baiae during this stage illustrates how gradual environmental change can reshape a city without immediate destruction. Unlike sudden events that disrupt all activity at once, the process here allowed for continued use even as conditions evolved. This created a period where the city existed between two states, still active, but no longer stable in its original form. The progression of submersion also contributed to the preservation of the city structures. Because the transition was slow, many elements remained in place as they moved below the waterline. Walls, floors, and architectural details were not displaced, but instead settled into their new environment. This process allowed the layout of the city to remain visible, even as it became part of the underwater landscape. As Baiae moved further into this stage, the ability to maintain and adapt structures diminished. The increasing presence of water limited what could be repaired or reinforced, and the resources required to sustain the city grew beyond what was practical. The balance between effort and outcome shifted, making it more difficult to justify continued maintenance in certain areas. The gradual nature of this transformation also influenced how the city was perceived. There may not have been a single moment when Baiae was considered lost. Instead, the process unfolded over time, with sections becoming unusable at different stages. This slow transition created a sense of change that was continuous, rather than defined by a clear beginning or end. As we move forward, the focus will shift toward the final stages of this transformation, where the accumulation of gradual changes leads to abandonment. The interaction between land and water, once balanced, will reach a point where the city can no longer function as it once did. This transition marks the movement from adaptation to departure, setting the stage for Baiae to become the submerged landscape that exists today. The transition from land to water also affected how boundaries were understood within the city. Spaces that had once been clearly defined by walls, pathways, and open ground became less distinct as water moved through them. Edges softened, and the separation between one area and another became less fixed, creating a landscape where former divisions were gradually blended together. This blending changed how structures related to one another. Buildings that had once stood apart with clear access points now appeared connected through the movement of water between them. Openings that had served as entrances or passageways became channels where water flowed, altering their purpose while preserving their original form. These changes did not remove the identity of the structures, but reshaped how they were experienced. The presence of water also introduced a different sense of stillness. As sections of the city became submerged, movement within those areas slowed or stopped entirely. Spaces that had once been active with daily use became quiet, holding their form without the activity that had once defined them. This contrast between active and inactive areas created a layered environment where the past remained visible even as it became inaccessible. Temperature differences between air and water added another dimension to this transformation. Submerged areas maintained a more consistent temperature, protected from the variations that affected the surface. This stability contributed to the preservation of materials, allowing details such as mosaics and stonework to remain intact over long periods. The water, while altering the use of the space, also acted as a protective layer. As the process continued, the city took on a new identity, no longer defined solely by its function as a place of residence and leisure, but by its transformation into a landscape shaped by gradual change. The structures remained, but their roles shifted, becoming part of a larger environment, where natural processes determined how they were experienced. This shift marks a key moment in the history of Baiae, where the balance between human design and environmental influence moved decisively toward the latter. The abandonment of Baiae did not occur at a single moment, but emerged gradually as the balance between adaptation and limitation shifted beyond what could be sustained. For a long period, the city had continued to function despite the steady movement of the land and the increasing presence of water. Adjustments had been made, systems had been maintained, and certain areas had remained usable even as others began to change. Gradually, however, the effort required to preserve this balance grew greater than what the environment would allow. As more sections of the city became consistently affected by water, the practicality of maintaining structures in those areas began to decline. Buildings that had once been central to daily life were no longer reliable, and pathways that had connected different parts of the city were disrupted. The infrastructure that supported movement, water management, and daily routines could no longer operate as intended in every part of the city, creating a fragmented environment where continuity was increasingly difficult to maintain. The process of leaving Baiae likely unfolded in stages, with residents gradually relocating rather than departing all at once. Higher areas likely remained occupied for longer periods, while lower sections were abandoned earlier as conditions made them less functional. This pattern created a slow withdrawal, where the active portion of the city became smaller over time as more areas were affected by the encroaching sea. As individuals and families moved away, the presence of daily activity diminished. Spaces that had once been defined by movement, conversation, and routine became quieter, holding their structure but no longer serving their original purpose. The absence of maintenance accelerated the effects of environmental change, as systems that had once been carefully managed were no longer actively supported. The bath complexes, which had been central to life in Baiae, were among the structures most affected by this shift. Their reliance on controlled water systems made them particularly vulnerable to changes in elevation and water flow. As the surrounding environment became less stable, these systems could no longer function as intended, reducing the usefulness of the baths and contributing to the overall decline of the city's activity. Residential structures followed a similar pattern. Villas that had once been maintained as places of comfort and status became increasingly difficult to preserve. Exposure to moisture, changes in ground stability, and the absence of regular upkeep all contributed to a gradual decline in their condition. While many of these structures remained standing, their ability to support daily life was reduced. The movement of people away from Baiae also affected the systems that had supported its economy and operation. Workers who had maintained infrastructure, managed resources, and provided services were no longer present in the same numbers. Without these systems in place, the city could not sustain the level of activity that had once defined it. The decision to leave Baiae was likely influenced by a combination of practical and environmental factors. As conditions changed, the cost of maintaining structures and systems increased, while the benefits of remaining in the area decreased. At a certain point, relocation became the more practical option, leading to a gradual shift away from the city. Despite this departure, the structures of Baiae were not immediately lost. The gradual nature of the transformation meant that buildings remained in place even as they were no longer used. Walls, floors, and architectural features continued to define the layout of the city, preserving a record of its design even as its function faded. The interaction between abandonment and environmental change created a unique condition. Unlike cities that were destroyed by sudden events, Baiae entered a state where its physical form remained while its activity ceased. This separation between structure and use is a key aspect of its history, allowing the city to transition into a different state without losing its identity entirely. As the sea continued to move into the city, the distinction between abandoned space and active environment became less clear. Areas that had once been empty but intact began to interact more directly with water, accelerating their transition into submerged conditions. This progression linked the process of abandonment with the ongoing geological changes, creating a continuous flow from one stage to the next. The visual appearance of Baiae during this period would have reflected this transition. Some areas likely appeared largely unchanged, while others showed clear signs of transformation. The coexistence of these conditions created a landscape where the past remained visible alongside the effects of ongoing change. The absence of people also altered the sensory environment of the city. Without the presence of daily activity, sounds that had once defined the space were replaced by the quieter movement of water and the natural surroundings. This shift contributed to the sense of stillness that would later characterize the submerged remains of Baiae. Gradually, the process of abandonment reached a point where the city no longer functioned as a place of residence or leisure. The systems that had supported it were no longer active, and the conditions required for daily life could not be maintained. What remained was a physical structure that continued to exist within an environment that was steadily changing. The transition from active city to abandoned structure marks a significant stage in the history of Baiae. It represents the moment when human activity gave way to natural processes, allowing the environment to reshape the city without resistance. This shift set the stage for the final transformation, where the interaction between land and water would define the future of the site. As Baiae moved fully into this state, the structures that remained became part of a larger environmental system. Their role changed from supporting daily life to existing as elements within a shifting landscape. This transformation did not erase the city, but redefined it, creating a connection between its past and its future as a submerged site. The story of abandonment in Baiae is therefore not one of sudden loss, but of gradual transition. It reflects the limits of adaptation within a changing environment and the point at which human systems can no longer maintain balance with natural forces. This process leads directly into the next stage, where the city becomes fully integrated into the underwater landscape that preserves it today. The process of abandonment also changed how time was experienced within the city. During its active years, time had been structured by routines, gatherings, and the movement of people between spaces. As these patterns faded, time became less defined, no longer marked by daily activity, but by the gradual progression of environmental change. Structures remained in place, but without the rhythm that had once given them purpose. This shift affected how different areas of Baiae related to one another. Without continuous movement connecting them, spaces became isolated, each holding its own state of preservation or transformation. A villa might remain largely intact, while nearby pathways became unusable, or a bath complex could still hold its form, even as access to it disappeared. This uneven transition created a landscape where change did not occur uniformly, but varied from one location to another. The absence of maintenance also allowed natural processes to take a more direct role in shaping the environment. Without systems in place to manage water flow or reinforce structures, small changes began to accumulate more quickly. Surfaces that had once been protected experienced longer exposure to moisture, and areas that had been stabilized began to shift more freely with the movement of the land. Meanwhile, the lack of human intervention meant that the city was no longer being altered or rebuilt. This absence of change preserved the original arrangement of structures, allowing the layout of Baiae to remain visible even as its function disappeared. Walls stayed aligned, floors remained in place, and the organization of space continued to reflect the design choices made during the city's active period. The gradual withdrawal from Baiae also influenced how the surrounding region developed. As residents relocated, activity shifted to more stable areas, reducing the importance of Baiae within the broader network of settlements. The city's role changed from a destination of wealth and leisure to a location defined by its changing environment. Despite this shift, the memory of Baiae likely persisted for some time. Knowledge of the city, its reputation, and its transformation would have been carried by those who had lived there or visited it. These accounts contributed to an understanding of the site, even as it moved beyond active use, preserving its identity in a different form. As environmental conditions continued to change, the remaining structures moved further into a state where human use was no longer possible. The balance that had once allowed adaptation gave way to a condition where natural forces determined how the city would exist. This marked the final stage of abandonment, where Baiae transitioned completely from a functioning settlement to a landscape shaped by its environment. The result of this process is a city that was not destroyed, but gradually released from human control. Its structures remain as they were arranged, but their purpose has shifted entirely. This transformation creates a unique record of how a city can move from activity to stillness without losing its physical form, setting the stage for its preservation beneath the sea. After the gradual abandonment of Baiae, the city entered a new stage of existence, one defined not by human activity, but by the steady influence of the underwater environment. As the land continued to sink and the sea moved further inland, the remaining structures became fully integrated into the waters of the Bay of Naples. This transition did not erase the city, but instead preserved it in a form that would remain largely unchanged for extended periods. The process of submersion created conditions that were different from those found on land. Once beneath the water, structures were no longer exposed to wind, temperature variation, or the constant cycle of drying and moisture that can weaken materials over time. Instead, they existed in a more stable environment where change occurred slowly and consistently. This stability played a significant role in the preservation of Baiae's physical features. Stone surfaces, which had already been shaped to withstand environmental conditions, responded well to prolonged exposure to water. Without the repeated expansion and contraction caused by temperature changes, these materials maintained their form more effectively. Walls remained aligned, and architectural elements retained their original positions, allowing the layout of the city to stay visible even after submersion. Mosaics, which had once decorated floors and walls, were also preserved in this environment. Protected from direct exposure and disturbance, their patterns remained intact beneath the water. The stillness of the underwater setting allowed these details to remain in place, offering a clear view of the decorative elements that had once contributed to the experience of the city. The presence of water also limited the types of changes that could occur. Without regular human activity, there was no rebuilding, removal, or modification of structures. This absence of intervention meant that Baiae was effectively preserved at a particular stage in its development. The city did not evolve further, but remained as it had been at the point of abandonment, creating a snapshot of its design and organization. Sediment gradually settled over parts of the city, adding another layer of preservation. This material covered certain surfaces, protecting them from movement and reducing the impact of currents. While not all areas were equally covered, this process contributed to the long-term stability of many structures, allowing them to remain intact beneath the water. The underwater environment also altered how the city could be experienced. Light filtered through the surface, creating shifting patterns that moved across walls and floors. Colors appeared differently beneath the water, and details took on a softer quality. These changes did not obscure the structures, but transformed the way they were perceived, adding a new dimension to the city's appearance. For long periods, Baiae remained largely undisturbed. Without active exploration, the submerged city existed quietly beneath the surface, its structures holding their form while the surrounding environment continued to shift gradually. This period of stillness contributed to the preservation of the site, allowing it to remain in a condition that could later be studied. The rediscovery of Baiae began when divers and researchers started to explore the waters along the coastline. Initial observations revealed the presence of structures beneath the surface, leading to further investigation. As exploration continued, the extent of the city became more apparent, with buildings, pathways, and open spaces identified across a wide area. Underwater archaeology provided a method for studying these remains in detail. Divers documented the layout of structures, recorded the condition of materials, and mapped the arrangement of the city. This work allowed for a better understanding of how Baiae had been organized and how it had changed over time. The process of mapping the city beneath the water revealed a level of preservation that was unusual compared to many other historical sites. Because the structures had not been displaced, their positions reflected the original design of the city. This made it possible to reconstruct the layout with a high degree of accuracy, providing insight into how different areas were connected. Discoveries within Baiae included bath complexes, residential spaces, and decorative elements that reflected the wealth and design of the city during its active period. Statues were found resting in place, and architectural features, such as columns and walls, remained aligned. These findings confirmed historical descriptions of Baiae as a place of luxury and detailed construction. The study of Baiae also contributed to a broader understanding of geological processes. By examining how the city had been affected by bradyseism, researchers gained insight into how gradual land movement can influence coastal environments. This connection between archaeology and geology made Baiae an important site for multiple fields of study. As interest in the site grew, efforts were made to preserve it in its underwater state. Regulations and protective measures were introduced to limit disturbance and ensure that the remains could be studied and observed without damage. This approach recognized the value of Baiae not only as a historical location, but as a resource for ongoing research. The presence of divers and researchers introduced a new form of interaction with the city. While it was no longer a place of residence, Baiae became a site of exploration, where individuals could observe its structures in a way that was not possible on land. This interaction, however, was carefully managed to maintain the condition of the site. The underwater setting also influenced how the city was documented. Photography, mapping, and recording techniques were adapted to account for the conditions beneath the surface. These methods allowed for detailed observation while preserving the integrity of the structures, ensuring that information could be gathered without altering the site. Baiae's transformation into an underwater environment created a unique connection between past and present. The structures that had once supported daily life now served as evidence of how that life was organized. The preservation of these elements allowed for direct observation of a Roman city in a state that had not been significantly altered since its abandonment. The quiet nature of the underwater setting also contributed to how Baiae is understood today. Without the presence of modern construction or continuous change, the site retains a sense of stillness that reflects its final stage of transformation. This stillness allows for a clearer view of the relationship between design and environment, highlighting the conditions that shaped the city over time. As the city continued to be studied, it became recognized as an important example of how gradual environmental change can preserve as well as alter a city. The combination of submersion, stability, and limited disturbance created a condition where the past remains accessible, even as it exists within a different environment. This stage of Baiae's history represents a transition from a place defined by human activity to one defined by observation and study. The structures remain, but their role has shifted, allowing them to provide insight into both the history of the city and the processes that shaped it. From this point, the focus moves toward the broader significance of Baiae, including what it represents in terms of environmental change, historical preservation, and the relationship between human design and natural forces. The legacy of the city extends beyond its physical remains, offering a perspective on how gradual transformation can create lasting records of the past. The legacy of Baiae extends beyond its physical remains, reaching into broader ideas about how cities interact with their environments and how change unfolds over time. While the structures beneath the water provide a visible record of Roman design and daily life, the deeper significance of Baiae lies in the process that shaped its transformation. The city stands as an example of how gradual environmental forces can influence human settlement in ways that are not always immediately understood. One of the most important aspects of Baiae's legacy is its demonstration of long-term change. Unlike locations that were affected by sudden events, Baiae reveals how small shifts, repeated over time, can lead to large-scale transformation. The process of bradyseism did not produce immediate destruction, but its cumulative effect altered the entire structure of the city. This gradual change challenges the idea that significant impact must come from dramatic events, showing instead that steady processes can reshape environments in lasting ways. The preservation of Baiae also offers insight into how conditions can protect as well as transform. The underwater environment, which marked the end of the city's active life, became the factor that allowed its structures to remain intact. This dual role of water, as both a force of change and a means of preservation, highlights the complexity of environmental interaction. It shows that the same conditions that alter a space can also ensure its survival in a different form. Baiae provides a clear example of how human design is influenced by the environment in which it exists. The city was built to take advantage of natural features such as thermal water, coastal views, and stable terrain. These elements shaped its layout, its architecture, and its daily life. Meanwhile, the environment imposed limits that could not be avoided. The gradual sinking of the land illustrates how even carefully designed systems remain connected to larger natural processes. The relationship between benefit and risk is central to understanding Baiae. The features that made the city desirable were the same ones that contributed to its transformation. Thermal activity provided warmth and comfort, but also indicated the presence of geological forces that affected stability. The coastal setting offered access and beauty, but also placed the city within reach of the sea as conditions changed. This balance between advantage and vulnerability is a key theme in the story of Baiae. The study of Baiae has also contributed to modern understanding of coastal environments. By examining how the city responded to gradual land movement, researchers have gained insight into how similar processes may affect other regions. This knowledge extends beyond historical interest, providing context for how current and future changes in the environment can influence human settlements. In addition to its scientific value, Baiae holds cultural significance as a representation of Roman life at a particular stage in its development. The preserved structures reflect the priorities and practices of a society that placed importance on leisure, comfort, and social interaction. The arrangement of spaces, the use of materials, and the integration of natural features all reveal how these values were expressed through design. The absence of later modification in Baiae allows for a clearer understanding of these cultural elements. Because the city was not rebuilt or extensively altered after its abandonment, its original layout remains visible. This provides a direct connection to the past, allowing observation of how spaces were used and how they related to one another. In this way, Baiae serves as a record of both physical structure and cultural practice. The transformation of Baiae also raises questions about how cities adapt to changing conditions. While the city was able to adjust for a time, there came a point where adaptation was no longer sufficient. This transition from adjustment to abandonment illustrates the limits of human response within certain environmental contexts. It shows that while systems can be designed to manage change, they cannot always overcome it entirely. The quiet presence of Baiae beneath the water adds another layer to its legacy. The city exists in a state that is both preserved and altered, accessible yet distant. This condition creates a sense of continuity, where the past remains visible but is no longer active. The stillness of the underwater environment contrasts with the activity that once defined the city, highlighting the passage of time in a tangible way. Baiae also serves as a reminder of how environments can shape not only physical structures, but patterns of behavior and ways of life. The availability of thermal water, the layout of the coastline, and the stability of the land all influenced how people lived, moved, and interacted. These factors created a specific type of environment that supported a particular form of daily life, demonstrating the connection between place and experience. The long-term preservation of Baiae allows for continued observation and study. As techniques in underwater exploration improve, new details can be identified and a deeper understanding of the site can be developed. This ongoing process ensures that Baiae remains relevant, not only as a historical location, but as a source of information about both the past and the processes that shape it. In a broader sense, Baiae illustrates how history can be layered within the environment. The city exists as part of a larger system that includes geological activity, coastal processes, and human design. Each of these elements contributes to the overall story, creating a complex and interconnected record that extends beyond a single period. The legacy of Baiae therefore lies in its ability to connect multiple ideas. It links human activity with natural forces, preservation with transformation, and past experience with present observation. Through this connection, the city offers a perspective on how environments and societies interact over time, shaping outcomes that are both predictable and unexpected. As this exploration comes to a close, Baiae can be understood as more than a lost city beneath the sea. It is a place where design, environment, and time come together, creating a record that continues to exist even after its original purpose has ended. The structures beneath the water remain as a reflection of what once was, while also serving as a reminder of how change, when allowed to unfold gradually, can preserve as much as it transforms. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you enjoyed learning about Baiae.